Hi, Dr. Taylor.
Hi, Darryl.
Hi. So thank you for doing this. Welcome to our conference. We have a lot of people interested in trying to understand what a clinical trial actually is today. Everyone has heard the term, and certainly with vaccines being a thing, but no one really, today I want in the next 30, 45 minutes, everyone walks away, comes home, or stays home watching this, feeling comfortable they get it. And they know whether it fits into their life or not. Before we begin, can you tell us what kind of doctor you are and where you practice?
Thank you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you discussing this. It's very important to a lot of things going on kind of currently around the world and for cancer research in particular. So I am a urologist and I specialize in urologic oncology. So I do primarily surgical care of urologic cancers, focusing on prostate cancer, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, and some of the more rare genital cancers. And I work predominantly in the VA system. I'm a full-time surgeon at the Houston VA, so the Michael DeBakey VA Medical Center in Houston, Texas, and I'm on faculty at Baylor College of Medicine, where I'm very involved in medical education and clinical research.
Great. So when you see patients, what sort of would cause you to sort of say the words clinical trial to somebody in your office?
So there's a wide range of opportunities for clinical trials. Sometimes they are to study the routine care that we provide. So sometimes a clinical trial can actually be a structured way to learn more about sometimes patient decisions, sometimes clinician decisions, sometimes comparing different strategies that are all standard of care. So there are some clinical trials that occur without testing a new intervention or drug or treatment. And then there are the clinical trials that most people think of where there is a study of an intervention or a treatment or a drug and comparing that to either something that is already an established standard treatment or comparing it to placebo. And so that is an interventional clinical trial. And those become more the common clinical trial that's offered when a patient has something like cancer and they get to a point in the cancer where maybe they either have not responded, the cancer has not responded to what has been the traditional treatment recommendation, or they may have a more unusual, uncommon variant or form of the cancer. And so the clinician is recommending enrolling in a clinical trial to try to test something different, an addition of a new drug that's been made available or gone through the FDA recently, things like that.
And if you would just pop the microphone just a teeny bit away from your mouth.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it does a little pop here and there.
Yeah. Well, we're all learning audiovisual stuff. They didn't teach us that in school, but they are, well, for some people perhaps. So it's sort of, the obvious question is, if clinical trials have things that are useful to a patient sitting in front of you, why is that something different or considered in a different way than just offering aspirin or abiraterone?
I think that's a question that comes to us very commonly from our patients. And clinical trials in general can be done in a way that studies a group without a comparison or studies a group with a comparison, meaning a group that didn't get the treatment. So when a drug is new to the market or is newly developed, for example, that drug will be studied sometimes in an unblinded fashion with a group of patients who all have a certain condition, for example, prostate cancer. And you want to see, is there safety and is there some evidence of a response by the cancer to the treatment? Once you've established both safety and response, the potential for response, that's not good enough to then make it widely available to everyone with that level of cancer or condition. You then have to test it in a way that's more rigorous and more structured and more objective to determine if the response that you observed in that first group is actually going to be replicated when you compare it to either no treatment or the pre-existing standard of treatment, that kind of thing. So a clinical trial is a scientific method at the end of the day to help us confirm observations that we think we see in one patient or a group of patients. Because the anecdotal or small numbers of patients that might have a certain observed response is not good enough to make something widely available to everyone without more rigorous objective tests.
So let's get into what's in it for patients. We could get into phase 1, 2, 3 trials. We could get into placebo, as you've already explained, and all the different ways of doing the statistical analysis. What's fascinating about the vaccine trials and a revelation to many, many people is you could vaccinate 30,000 people, but you only need like 100, 150 positive responses to know how well the thing is working, which is, an astounding, kind of what just happened.
Ratio.
Yeah. But, people in general aren't exposed to that kind of analysis on that massive scale, nor should they be, because all disease should be irrelevant to all of us, ideally. So, but since it's not, clinical trials are opportunities for treatments that aren't like available in a normal setting. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that sometimes it's a treatment that already is maybe in practice, but it hasn't yet been proven scientifically, or it's a treatment that's new. And so it's not yet widely available and it needs to be tested first.
Right. And when it gets to the point where you're offering it to patients, or most urologists and oncologists and radiation oncologists, et cetera, are offering it to patients, and social workers like myself are suggesting, patients consider it and such, it's already gone through the initial, usually it's gone through the initial testing part that tells you whether or not it's going to kill people or not.
Exactly. Yes.
So safety is, it's something to keep in mind, but that's something to keep in mind about everything.
I think there are a lot of safeguards in place, and the FDA creates these, and a lot of our national organizations that oversee research create a lot of these safety mechanisms so that there is a discussion of risk. It's always important to understand that a treatment could have risks that we don't expect, but generally we know what risks are par for the course for a certain treatment, and then we can discuss those relative to the risk of the condition. So the risk of the cancer is what we're comparing sometimes. Definitely weighing those risks and making sure the patient is willing with full informed consent, but we would absolutely not offer a treatment that is either not likely to have some type of, or thought to have some type of response, or that has too many side effects to make it dangerous.
Yeah, and let's spend good that you brought up consent. Let's spend like 5 solid minutes on that at least, because the idea of consent, there's the legal construct around it, there's the ethical construct, all of that. But when you're a patient and you're considering a novel therapy, something new that's yet to be approved in a formal setting, and approved for your precise presentation, your disease, consent sort of is like one of these National Lampoon radio show things from 100 years ago, where you're talking to your dog and the dog only hears the word food, it doesn't hear anything else you're saying. Consent really, imagine, surgical patients sign 30 pages of consent that they don't read. We all accept terms of agreement on our software, and sign off liabilities on insurance and cars and such. Consent, basically, I guess my point is, consent is sort of like a meaningless kind of thing, in the sense like it's, I don't know what percentage, but 1 in 1,000 people is actually paying attention to that in a really useful way, beyond the sense like hearing the word risk. In fact, go ahead.
Yeah, I think going into that conversation about considering being in a clinical trial and considering taking a drug or a treatment that is being studied, it's important to ask a lot of questions and then unfortunately look through that lengthy document or expect that the person consenting you is going to give you the facts that you need to be fully informed. There are often drugs that have been used in other conditions, for example, other cancers, and those drugs are now being studied in a new cancer, but there's a lot of evidence and a lot of data and a lot of safety that's already documented for that drug, for example. When something, when the drug is being tested, when there isn't a lot of data, it's usually in a population that has more advanced disease or more rare disease or something that's been harder to get treatment options for. And I think that sometimes, like you said, the willingness to participate is almost, you know, unconditional, because it sounds like the chance that you might have to get treatment. Luckily, in prostate cancer, I would say that in almost every category, every clinical scenario, there are some very good established treatment regimens. So one of the positives is that you're going to be getting either the established treatment regimen that we know has some effectiveness, or a newer treatment regimen that we're testing and we want to see, is it equal to, better than, worse than the standard one. So one of the great things, at least in the prostate cancer world, is that so much has already come through the scientific process to the market and through the FDA to be approved for treatment, that you're very rarely doing a situation where it's being compared to placebo at this point for most of the levels of prostate cancer treatments that are being tested.
Yeah, and you know, just to sort of close out this idea of risk and consent. I mean, most of the consent is really about the relationship between the patient and you know, and or their doctor and such. I mean, it's not that I mean, you may, in fact, I don't know. I mean, you may sit down with the patient and go through pages of material, but I mean, basically the patient, you know, the patient's saying, you're saying, try this. And the patient in their heart is saying, I know you're not trying to kill me.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize too that sometimes there's a misconception that a clinical trial sponsored by a pharma company is automatically going to have some bias, some conflict of interest. And I think that that's also something important, that, you know, those of us who are investigators, who do clinical trials, who are physicians, we are always operating in our patient's best interest. And unfortunately, the way R&D works for drug development and how drugs actually get to market, there is a process that requires uh, a structured support, and that does often come from the pharmaceutical companies, but they are not inherently bad or evil, you know, bringing these trials to us. And most often there are a lot of doctors, clinicians, investigators who treat the cancer, and they went to the company first and said, I have an idea. And then the company said, oh, I think that's a great idea. We want to support that. So even these massive trials that are going on across the country or across the world often started with the seed of the oncologist or the surgeon who treats that cancer day in and day out, seeing that there may be a rationale or a reason why it might be worth trying something new or something different.
Right. And, you know, no, and, you know, and I guess for disclosure, I mean, Malecare is also, we have a trial running right now. We're an NIH funded group, you know, organization. I'm an NIH funded investigator and such, you know, I've done trials like you and others and such. We're good people, most of us.
Right.
But there are people who are just motivated to put people in trials. And I don't know whether that's, you know, just a rare occurrence or a percentage we got to deal with as a profession or as a healthcare world, but it exists, you know, and you know, I mean, no discussion about clinical trials should be without a mention of Tuskegee and other things like that. But, you know, those are concerns on a you know, a heightened level, on a day-to-day level, patients are always or should wonder appropriately, no matter who they're sitting with, what's motivating the doctor to suggest this trial? What are
Of
the
course.
what do you think the questions the patient should ask around that?
Well, it does come down to what the facility is like and what kind of things they do. If you go into a place where every single patient without fail is on a clinical trial, that might be a good thing. But like you said, that also might indicate there's some ulterior motive. So you do want to ask yourself, what is the quality of this facility? Are there patient testimonies that can give me some idea of a patient's confidence in the system, whether or not a person's on a trial or not? Um, Knowing that investigators' conflict of interest is still worthwhile to look at, but understanding that sometimes when an investigator says my research is supported, that doesn't mean at all that the investigator is taking, some type of incentive from the company to put patients on the study. Um, I think it can be sticky. And I do think that's a valid concern to have, but I think that because of the rigor of the process to create these trials, most of the trials that you might find that are registered on clinicaltrials.gov, that are done in multiple centers, or even that are done in single centers, but that have a robust infrastructure, those are trustworthy. So it's better to err on the side of trusting it when you do see that there's a good reputation and a good track record for that investigator or that hospital or clinic.
Yeah. And clinicaltrials.gov, I mean, it's important. I mean, it's not it's not a gold standard as far as I mean, it's a fairly low bar to get listed in there, but it does take effort. I mean, I've gone through the effort. Or I mean, if somebody hasn't gone through that effort, that's no longer, I mean, you don't,
Right.
I
If
don't,
they
that's not
can't
a
produce
study.
to you
Yeah.
any sort of certified, sort of checklist or any sort of, registration of the trial, then that would definitely make me raise an eyebrow. Where is this actually a clinical trial, and what is the data going to be done? What's going to be done with the data and the evidence ultimately?
What are the questions patients should ask you and other urologists, urologic oncologists, and a whole bunch of folks that would sort of assure them this is a trial that's really about taking care of me?
Hmm. I mean, I think asking the investigator, if I'm not on the trial, what are my other options? If they don't have any other options for you, that should make you wonder sometimes. If you ask them, are there any other trials that you don't have available that you think I should look into? That's a valid question too. If they're working in a space of inquiry, for example, on a certain type of prostate cancer, a certain type of bladder cancer, they're going to know what's being discussed and proposed in other places too. And that transparency or honesty is probably something to be valued. You know, knowing if I don't do a clinical trial, are you still going to take care of me? Am I still going to be able to come here? That would be probably a good place to ask as well, a good thing to ask. And if there's some reason why I have a complication or I can no longer stay in this trial, what comes next? What's my next step? You should understand if that clinician, that doctor has an idea of where things go over the course of treatment and not just the discrete time for this one study. I
Yeah.
think those are some things.
No, those are good ones. Well done. But the idea of patients feeling obliged to be the good patient in front of their doctor comes into play,
Yeah.
sometimes. And, there's nothing you and I can present to our audience to say, get over that in an effective way. And it's cruel to say get over that because it's true. People want to be the good patient. They want to know that they want to be their doctor's favorite patient. They want to have the best, consults and the best information and suggestions, etc.
There's always um, a give and take in the relationship. And like you said, knowing that you've pleased the doctor by participating in their trial, you should also trust though that doctor is offering you the trial because it fits your clinical profile, it fits your disease specifically, and it's not being applied like a blanket to every single person coming in the door. I'd also say that I was going to say, I just lost there was another idea about the.
You'll get it in a minute.
Yeah, I know.
We could come back to
I don't know. That's a hard, I don't know. Just that most of it's important to look at the clinical trial as an opportunity to try to have an improved outcome, an improved survival. That's the reason your doctor is proposing it to you. It's not for their own personal advantage, gain, reputation, publicity. It's really to try to change the needle on how your cancer responds and how well your cancer can be controlled.
Yeah. Let's start moving this patient or all of the 1,000 people behind me in virtual listening mode. How does, once they're say, okay, I'm on board, enroll me, and they pass all the criteria, which are massive for most, and appropriately, you know, I mean, that's another hurdle and barrier that patients, I think, are undersold on, is that even if you agree, well, why don't you tell it? I mean, a patient agrees, now what?
Now you have to recognize that the clinical trial itself has a very specific calendar and schedule, and everything is based on timelines and doing certain tests, doing certain visits, doing infusions in a very strict window, plus or minus 7 days, plus or minus 3 days. So as the participant in the clinical trial, you do have to be willing to try to fulfill that schedule and that obligation. If not, there are certain things called protocol deviations, and when the investigators have to file some sort of note that there's been some sort of deviation from whatever was intended, and those aren't consequential usually, but they all have to be documented and tracked. I think knowing that there may be some costs that still come to you as a patient is important to remember, that even if you're on a clinical trial sponsored by a company, they might be providing the drug, but they won't be paying, for example, the infusion room fees or the nursing fees or some of the fluids or things like that. So it's not uncommon to still be charged for some of the visit, but every clinical trial has also a whole list of what is allowed and not allowed to be charged to the patient separate from the trial. So it's also within your right to ask to speak to a financial officer, speak to somebody in the clinical trial office to really know what's going to be your estimated cost of participating.
Yeah, and in our, I mean, we tell people it's not just a suggestion, you just do it. I mean, you don't, I mean, there's some basic entry, you know, requirements for a patient to take care of themselves, and finding out how much this will cost in a precise and long-term way, you know, cash-wise, is absolutely essential, including all the ancillary stuff. You know, what if I get nauseous? Are you going to pay for my anti-nausea medication? You know, if if I need another doctor for a fracture or something, you know, what if it screws up my bones in some way? You know, you're going to pay for that. You know, I mean, you would agree, those are, you know, that's just a common sense kind of thing, I think, right?
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What are a lot of patients in our, you know, they're concerned about privacy, and in lots of different levels. You know, if they're fortunate to be employed and enjoying their job, is my employer going to know? Can I keep this a secret from my family? Is my name going to be blasted in some publication? Am I going to have, you know, is the pharmaceutical company that may or may not be behind this particular investigation going to be hitting on me for testimonies and videos and things? You know, can you tell us the privacy concerns?
I think that's really important to think of, but also to trust that there's a lot of safeguards again in place. So individual patient data will never be shared with the pharmaceutical company, will never be shared with the article that gets published about the research. And so your individual data and your PHI, private health information, personal health information, is never going to be available to sort of the greater public in any way. A lot of studies are expected to be transparent in that they will publish patient level information. And so that may be as detailed as a supplemental table in an article that's put online, and the supplemental table will have a patient's maybe age, location, stage of cancer, but it will never show, who they were or any initials or any identifying numbers, medical record number, social security number. None of that will ever be traced or made available. And every institution has an institutional review board to do a clinical trial through the institution, whether or not it's an academic hospital or university or a large oncology clinic that does a lot of clinical trials. They all have to go through some type of regulation. And so all of these things have to be put in place in terms of data all being stored very securely on backup servers and not being transported on my laptop or a thumb drive. So there's not going to be the same HIPAA restrictions that apply to all clinical care apply even more so in the setting of clinical research, for sure.
Yeah, and another concern is around the durability of a trial. Patients, well, just sort of in a common sense kind of question, companies and businesses go out of business. What happened? Is it possible for me to enter a trial, be treated for a while, and then the trial stops and I'm left hanging?
I think that could happen, but that would be very unusual and very uncommon. Those are if a drug is so new that it's kind of in this startup phase, it's usually going to be only a short duration of a trial anyway. So it's really going to be kind of an early look at what's going on. Does the drug have an effect? Is it safe? It's going to be in that earlier phase probably. So I think that that's much less of a concern for any trial that you might be getting treatment for 6 months or a year or 2 years. There's going to be a lot of infrastructure and support under that.
Yeah, and you touched appropriately on placebo trials, et cetera. But from a patient, so a patient, wants, would want, if you're entering a trial, I want the thing, I want the
Right,
drug.
right.
How can I game that?
Well, there are a lot of procedures set in place to make sure that the patient cannot control that and that the clinician cannot control that. Even as the doctor, I can't say, I really think this person would be best if they got the drug. It's not possible in a placebo-controlled trial for me to make that determination myself. And there are these literally opening an envelope and seeing if it says A or B, and then being obligated to go that route for that patient. But there is a really important reason to make sure that the effect that is seen, let's say there's a positive effect and we think the drug works and we think the drug controls cancer, we have to have the setup where there's been a comparison to a group that did not get that treatment without bias, without an influence of other factors, to really make sure that everyone else can trust the results. Not just me as the doctor who might use it again for another patient, but the entire medical and patient community. If we want to believe that that drug works, it has to have gone through that level of rigor. And it is, even speaking as myself, a patient, it is frustrating to know that you could get it or you might not. I've been there, but it is really important for the quality of the outcome and the quality of counting on that result.
Yeah, but I mean, you're now in a conference with in a patient organization, and I mean, as much as we truly and genuinely care about science, I do myself, and many patients do, and all the 1,000 people behind me want things. You know, ultimately we want the damn drug, you know, in a
Yeah.
trial, you know. So there are a number of websites that sort of, I mean, they have quirky titles like, am I on a placebo? Well, that's not particularly quirky, but, you know, am I on a placebo? Where patients, you know, in a trial, they're comparing their side effects and the
Right.
experience. And, you know, some of them are very sophisticated and figure it out.
I don't think that's wrong. I don't think
Yeah.
it's inappropriate to try to determine if you're on drug. Ultimately, the doctor can't go and open the envelope and tell you, you know, sometimes even which you're on, because they're getting a drug from the research pharmacy in a bag and you don't know if the drug is in there or not. But it's wholly understandable and I would say justifiable to say, they said that there would be these side effects if I was getting the drug and I have one or two of those. And there may be a positive sort of feedback to that knowledge. You know, if you know you're getting the drug, it might make you more kind of okay with all the burden of the clinical trial. I guess the flip side is true, that if you think you're not getting the drug, stay with it because you may just not be having side effects. But it's a really natural desire. A lot of times, if you don't get the drug in the trial, though, there is not an access to the drug in any other venue. So a lot of times, the treatment that is being proposed as kind of the newest and greatest and next cutting edge thing won't be available for treatment. So sometimes doing the clinical trial, even if there's a 50-50 chance of getting the actual treatment, would be the only way to get it. And sometimes that's how you have to look at it. You know, I want that 50% chance of getting it. It's better than no chance.
Yeah, and just to unpack what you just said, just a teeny bit more, if you're not having side effects or not having the similar things that other people have for an extreme or whatever, that really doesn't mean you don't have the drug. I mean, it could be
Right.
you're just having a really swell experience with the drug,
Right.
in which case, super, you know. And the corollary, the adjunct to that idea is it's the only place to get the drug now anyway. So if you're not having side effects or you're having a swimming time and it's just an imposition on your time to show up somewhere or to take a pill or an injection or whatever and to be monitored, et cetera, then, you know, I mean, where's the harm in that outside of the time, you know?
Right.
So stick with it regardless because you really don't know. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's unethical and actually somewhere deep in FDA's, you know, multi-page documents, you can't design a placebo to mimic a side effect.
Oh,
Yeah.
definitely not. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And like I said earlier, I think it's important to emphasize that so many clinical trials right now, at least in, for example, prostate cancer, are being done against another treatment. So either arm you're in, you're going to be getting some treatment, whether or not you get the one that's the newest and greatest or you're getting the standard is sometimes the comparison. So it may not be compared to no treatment or
Yeah.
placebo.
So these days, we're in 2000, closing out 2020, entering 2021.
Whoa.
We're in the United States, even though we have an international audience, they're all interested in this and are aware that we have a racially diverse country and that typically, you know, Black men and Latino men in prostate cancer trials and transgender women and Native American people and gay people are typically a distinct minority in those trials.
Right.
And there's a struggle for pharmaceutical companies and others to include more diverse representation in trials, not just for the, the hi-ho public spirit and the goodness of, the appropriateness of that, but in a very real sense to understand the biological representation of the effect of the drug, whether it cuts across all, racial groups, all genetic lines, etc.
Absolutely.
So this, and that's a good thing. And it's a different conversation that I don't think we'll really get into very much now as to how to get more of that, more minority representation, more underserved community representation. But does that have an implication, and I know it does for some patients, that if they are representing or are a member of an unrepresented group, if you're a Black man in a trial and there are only 3% of people that look like you in that trial, or that fit your cohort, that that are you, if there are only 3% of Black men in a trial, does that mean they're being treated differently?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the cultural diversity in our clinical trials definitely has a lot of room to be improved on. I do think, interestingly, that a place like the Veterans Administration, where there already is a better representation of diversity in the patient population, the VA system has done an incredible job of making some of these trials answer these questions in all these different populations. But as a person in one of those populations, there should not be any concern about being offered the treatment differently or being treated differently in the clinical trial. I will say that it's possible that the clinician may not be able to predict as well how the drug might perform because they don't have as much evidence in your specific race or background. But that's even more reason why there's a need for that. And we're seeing some incredible things in prostate cancer treatment where there actually are improved responses in certain backgrounds with some of these newer drugs, especially the hormonal modulators, abiraterone and enzalutamide. And so there's a surprising or very welcome interest by the drug companies to actually go in and design trials specifically for those groups in the hospitals where they're more likely to be getting care, and in the communities where they're more likely to be getting care, to try to help highlight maybe these advantage kind of responses that have been seen. So sometimes it's not all of a negative risk, it's a positive risk.
Yeah, and as immunotherapy has been shown to, there was a really interesting trial showing Black men having better response and living like I think they got an extra 12 to 15 months of life, as a consequence of that. And Malecare did a survey showing that gay men in the advanced stage tend to have less need for and have a few months advantage in advanced stage once they get metastatic castrate-resistant setting. But that again sort of reinforces the mythic idea that if you're, let's say, a Black man in a trial, you're more likely to get the drug than the placebo, or more likely to get the investigated combination of drugs than the standard care, because the investigators want to find out how it works on Black people, and there just aren't enough Black people in the trial, so they're going to identify who to give it to or not. That just doesn't happen. Is that fair to say?
I think that's an interesting theory. I think what can happen, I don't think it would be, oh, look, it's a Black man, we can, fulfill the criteria better. But if they are trying to make sure that the population is well represented, there may be some stratification in the process. That means that that if there are fewer Black men total, then your chances just by probability might be higher, but it's still going to be on a 1-to-1, 50-50 kind of schedule.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about availability and access to clinical trials. We have a large rural audience, and we also have, we're known for our work in underserved communities and economically challenged families and people. Are clinical trials basically big urban settings, major cancer center kind of things?
I think that is one of the disadvantages still for access to clinical research, is that they are more often than not in bigger centers that can support that kind of work. But there are a lot of cancer center networks, and there are a lot of hospital networks that are now creating rural-based clinics, creating rural-based outreach, and trying to bring just that opportunity to more patients. So I think it's better by far than it used to be, but I think there's still a lot to be done to try to create that access. I mean, at least from my own personal experience working in the VA system, if I'm at Houston and someone 3 hours away wants to be in the clinical trial, it's very hard to have eyes on that patient at the frequency that's required by the study, unless the patient comes to Houston every single time. So it does create barriers that are very hard to overcome. But I will say that the supporting companies and the clinics that try to put these things together try to create some incentives or some help, whether it's transportation help or setting up televisits. Luckily, in this year, telemedicine has really gained traction that I think is not going to be lost, even if we get ahead of the pandemic. The ability to do televisits is really going to hopefully open up clinical research in a broader way.
Yeah. And you've mentioned the VA, I mean, you're in the VA system. Good, thank you for that. I mean, what are the differences in clinical trials and for patients in different healthcare systems? You know, massive, holding companies for hospitals, standalone community healthcare centers, VA, things like that.
One of the biggest things is sometimes the clinical trials that are being distributed and marketed are not going to be able to enroll patients in a certain setting because, for example, a clinical trial that's marketed to insured 60-year-olds is going to have a much harder time meeting the criteria in the VA population that's generally older and sicker, for example. So there are some differences in which clinical trials can really connect with the population that's in that system. So the VA system has to think about it sometimes to open clinical trials, or that they have to change the criteria to make the trial actually accessible to the veterans that are there. And so the VA as a whole nationally has done a great deal in the last, I'd say, decade to try to increase the collaboration with the NCI, to increase the collaboration with the cooperative groups that do research independently so that there can be better bridging of some of the research that is available, making it veteran specific. And there are bigger networks that are being developed and that have been developed to try to make research in the VA kind of its own contained thing. So there actually are VA cooperative group studies that have been done around the country that are taking off in cancer research. I think other systems, there may be some advantage to large hospital networks that span multiple states because they, for example, already have the IRB, and the IRB is centralized. And so the approval of the study is easier, simpler, more straightforward. So if there is a hospital system that is over a broader area or region, there may be more ease to disseminate, make that trial available in the other location because it's already in place somewhere in the umbrella of that network. So I think those are some potential advantages to having the big systems like that.
Yeah, and for people who are challenged, wheelchair bound, or have other disabilities in addition to their prostate cancer, how do clinical trials accommodate for things like that?
I think that the clinical trial, sometimes, depending on what stage it's at, where it is in that drug's development, sometimes the clinical trial is very strict and very rigid in the initial trial, for example. So they only want to take, I would say, the healthiest patients with the fewest comorbidities. But the next step of the trial, they want to make it more generalizable, more available to everyone. So the criteria are looser and more available to a lot of different patients with different health conditions and health capabilities. So that all depends for sure on the exact clinical trial. But I think that there is a policy, kind of across the board, that a clinical trial cannot discriminate solely on the basis of a disability. So that is kind of a tenet for any clinical research that goes on in the United States, at least.
Right, but clinical trials in the United States can discriminate against people living in other countries, though. I mean, if
Yes.
somebody has the wherewithal to participate in a trial in the United States and wants to fly in from Paris every month or whatever, they're out of luck for the most part.
For the most part, I don't,
Yeah.
yeah. Speaking from at least recollection, when I was at a big cancer center, you will certainly be able to participate, but you do have to be able to meet those sort of timeline requirements, those scheduled visits and things like that.
Hmm. I mean, I guess 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I did a search on clinicaltrials.gov just to see which were, required U.S. citizenship or U.S.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, when the whole citizenship thing came up,
yes, right, right, right.
just curious, and
Yeah.
it was almost all of them. I mean, I couldn't find. I mean, I found one, but it wasn't a prostate cancer one.
Oh, I don't
Uh,
know if I knew that actually.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully things have changed. I mean, the trial I'm doing now, it's 404 guys in collaboration with the University of Minnesota. That's got a USA-based requirement, and
Mm-hmm.
there's, I mean, there are a lot of similar things we're doing like
Yeah.
that. I mean, the point is not that we exclude for well-founded medical reasons. We want to have a clean body to investigate, so to speak, so we know what's
Right.
going on. But geography seems to be less than a properly confounding criteria.
Right. No, it's a
I-
good point.
yeah.
I don't know if that's more to do with the financial structure sometimes too. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in the time we have remaining, two things. One, trials are about investigating therapies and treatments. Trials has an endpoint, and the patient is dismissed or given a going away box of candy or something. And, um, the and do ask for good. If it's candy, don't settle for crap. Go for the high end Belgian chocolates.
There you go.
Yeah, really. I mean, it's a shame when trials go cheap at the end. But in a worse case, in worse than the bad chocolate, is the idea that the patient no longer has access to the investigated therapy.
Mm-hmm.
What
Yeah.
happens at that point?
That is a really big challenge. And again, it's very dependent. There are certain trials where they've built in a clause that if the patient is in the arm that there is a response or the patient's cancer is responding, there is a way to have a special granted access to continue drug, but that is probably less common than the scenario where the trial is over and the access is gone, because a lot of times that trial is being done to get the drug approved by the FDA. And so until the trial ends, the follow-up ends, sometimes there's follow-up that has to go on for some number of months or even years before the trial can be closed and reported. That is definitely a necessary step or barrier in the treatment for an individual patient. But I think that is a recognized problem, and more trials have tried to create these opportunities to allow a patient to stay on the drug before it is through all of those regulatory approval kind of hurdles.
Yeah. In the time we have remaining, what are the things that we haven't talked about that you think are important for patients or just good for patients to know?
I would say, there is a built-in inquiry. There's always a curiosity on the part of the drug companies and the investigators and the scientists and the clinicians. But as the patient, you can also propose, suggest, create an observation that might lead to the next question and might lead to the next research. So don't be shy to make a suggestion or to make a comment or some type of commentary on how your treatment has gone, because you never know where that might spark the next the next question or the next line of clinical research. So that's one thing. You are a partner in that, much more so than just a number or a participant. I don't know. What else
Well,
is important to come
but
away with? Yeah.
the idea of being a partner in that is really a good point, really a good I don't know, feeling, in the sense that when you're in a relationship with your doctor, if I'm a patient and I'm in a relationship with my doctor, I'm seeing the man or woman, I'm taking their advice, occasionally questioning them, paying them, it's different than the relationship you have in a trial with investigators. I mean, more or less, you're not paying them.
Right.
I mean, more or less, you're not necessarily striving to be the good patient because you're a number, not a name. I mean, within your room, and people know you'll introduce yourselves, and whatever, share niceties and such. But generally, you're not really there in like creating a long-term lasting interaction. You're there to get something that you need, something
Right.
you want. And as you say, you're also, like it or not, or even whether or not that was your primary goal, you are now a partner in that research, a genuine partner, not a participant, not a subject.
Right.
You are, you're a co-investigator in a loose sense,
Yeah.
and
It couldn't be done without you. There's no
yeah,
doubt. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it'd be a weird thing, but the, the idea, I mean, everyone wants to know what's going on. I mean, be, the most expressive person you've ever been in your life,
Totally. Yeah.
yeah. It's almost an opportunity to have that experience.
Yes. And it is, especially in the process of living with cancer, going through cancer treatment, it is a point in that process where you have a say and where you can really have an influence. And that is a great sense of, security and confidence that's important when there's so many unknowns and there's so much uncertainty. This is part of the aspect of it that gives you something to really be holding on to and having a little control over how it's being done.
Dr. Taylor, thank you for sharing your insights around clinical trials and warming us up to them, and also being frank about the challenges and negatives that some of that trials sometimes have. It's not a perfect situation, but it's sort of the best science has right now. Until we get robot people. And
I
who wouldn't?
appreciate the chance to have the dialogue. It's really important and has raised some good food for thought, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Give all your trial participants good chocolate, and let's hope for robot people.
That's
And
right.
okay. Thank you very much, and welcome to our conference.
Thank you.